On Saturday, October 4th, 2025, my husband stood barefoot in our kitchen and tried to remove a crease from his funeral shirt with a handheld facial steamer. Golden morning light spilled through the blinds, catching the vapor around his head like stage fog. "That costs more than your shirt," I warned, taking it from him before he cooked the buttons. Eric grinned and kissed my cheek. At 39, he still had the crooked smile that had charmed me 9 years earlier. "Then your fancy little machine should be honored," he said. "Today it gets to perform a public service." If family drama has ever entered your home wearing a sympathetic smile, subscribe to the channel. You'll understand why I missed the warning signs. The funeral was for my grandmother, the woman who had taught me that financial independence was not a lack of faith in marriage. It was basic adult hygiene. She had died after a brief decline, leaving behind neatly labeled files, an organized estate, and a family history nobody wanted discussed over coffee. I was 36, a licensed esthetician and the owner of a skincare clinic downtown. My condo in Brookland was 4 miles from the clinic, though Washington traffic could stretch that drive from 20 minutes to 35. I had bought the condo before marrying Eric, and every deed, payment record, and HOA statement carried my name. Still, I called it our home. That distinction felt loving then, not dangerous. Eric had chosen the paint in the bedroom, assembled the walnut-colored media console, and installed the aquarium against the living room wall, after promising that watching fish would lower my blood pressure. The tank held a restless little community of tetras, corridoras, and one striped loach that appeared only when the room was quiet. Eric cleaned the filter. I fed them, especially after late shifts, when the soft bubbling helped me come down from hours of bright treatment lights, chemical peels, client worries, and the constant pressure of owning a business. The condo fee was $620 a month, and I paid it alone. I also covered the mortgage, utilities, insurance, groceries, and most of our ordinary expenses. My clinic brought me $7,200 net each month. But that number looked more generous on paper than it felt after business overhead, taxes, and household bills. Eric earned $0. He had been a sales manager until his company eliminated his position, and at first, his unemployment had seemed temporary. He updated his resume, took calls with recruiters, and practiced interview answers at the dining table. I believed supporting him was simply what marriage required during a hard season. That morning, he seemed embarrassed when I handed him a tie and asked whether he had heard back from a medical device company. His expression tightened for half a second before he said the hiring manager was still deciding. I touched his arm and told him there was no pressure from me. That was true, or at least I wanted it to be. "We're a team," I said. Eric nodded, but instead of looking relieved, he glanced toward the counter where my clinic keys rested beside my purse. "Easy to say when you're the one with somewhere important to be," he muttered. I thought grief had made him irritable. My grandmother had never disliked Eric, but she had never indulged him either. When he talked about launching a consulting business without a written plan, she asked what problem his clients would be paying him to solve. When he called the condo our investment one Thanksgiving, she corrected him in her dry, calm voice. "It's Maya's property and your home," she had said. "Those can both be true." Eric laughed in front of everyone, then complained privately that she enjoyed making him feel small. I defended her, but gently, which meant I defended neither of us effectively. We drove to the funeral in mild autumn weather, passing rows of brick homes under trees turning copper and yellow. Linda, Eric's 65-year-old mother, called while we were on the way. A retired teacher, she had perfected a concerned tone that made criticism sound like a wellness check. She asked whether Eric had eaten, whether his shirt was properly pressed, and whether I was planning to stay beside him during the service, because funerals could be emotionally destabilizing for men between careers. Eric put her on speaker. I told her we were fine, then watched him smile at the windshield as if his mother had just awarded him a medal. Linda lived in Silver Spring, 7 miles from our condo and about 25 minutes away in ordinary traffic. We saw her often enough that she had opinions about everything from our grocery budget to how frequently married couples should sit down to dinner. She had recently begun asking why my clinic stayed open into the evening on certain days. Eric must have mentioned it, because I had not. When I explained that working clients needed later appointments, Linda sighed and said, "Success is lovely, Maya, but a home notices when a woman is missing." I laughed, because the alternative was asking what century she thought we lived in. At the service, Eric held my hand. That mattered to me. Grief came in strange waves. The smell of furniture polish in the chapel, the first notes of a hymn my grandmother used to hum, the sight of her reading glasses folded beside a framed photograph. I remembered sitting at her kitchen table while she showed me how to compare loan terms. I remembered her slipping cash into birthday cards, even after I was old enough to earn my own. Most of all, I remembered how she could make a boundary sound as ordinary as locking a door at night. You did it because the things inside mattered. Afterward, people gathered in loose circles outside, squinting in the golden light and speaking in lowered voices. Linda hugged me stiffly, then immediately adjusted Eric's collar. Friends of my grandmother told me how proud she had been of the clinic. One woman remembered serving as a practice client when I was still in aesthetics school. For a few minutes, sadness felt clean and uncomplicated. Eric brought me water without being asked. I leaned against him, grateful for the familiar weight of his arm, and wondered whether I had been unfair to notice his recent resentment. Marriage, I reminded myself, was not an audit. Then Ryan Cole appeared at the edge of the crowd. Ryan was my distant cousin, 48 years old, and nearly a stranger by choice. He wore a dark suit that fit across the shoulders but pulled at the waist, and he carried no program from the service. I knew immediately he had not been inside. He waited until people began leaving before walking toward me with both hands visible, as though approaching a nervous animal. "Maya," he said, offering a solemn nod instead of a hug. "I heard late. I came as soon as I could." His voice had the polished warmth of someone who had rehearsed sounding wounded. I had not seen him in years, but I knew exactly why his branch of the family stayed away. In 2008, Ryan's father had forged my grandmother's checks. She discovered the withdrawals, confronted him, and removed him from her estate. There had been no dramatic reconciliation afterward, despite several relatives urging her to forgive him for the sake of appearances. Ryan insisted his father had made a desperate mistake and repaid what he could. My grandmother insisted that remorse arriving after discovery was not the same as honesty. Ryan had treated her decision as theft ever since, as though an inheritance were wages his family had already earned. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. The wording landed oddly, as if the woman in the casket belonged to me, but not to him. His gaze shifted past my shoulder to Eric, and something softened in his face. They shook hands. Eric introduced himself, even though Ryan clearly remembered him from our wedding. Ryan said he had followed my clinic's success online, then observed that I had done very well, while his own side of the family had been pushed out. I felt Eric's arm leave my back. The movement was small, but I noticed the cold space instantly. "This isn't the day," I told Ryan. I kept my voice quiet because several mourners were still close enough to hear. He lifted his palms and said he did not want conflict. He only wanted fairness and a chance to examine the circumstances around my grandmother's final documents. I told him her attorney had handled everything, and Ryan smiled without humor. Attorneys handle what they're told to handle, he said. That doesn't make the result right. Eric looked between us, interested now, while my stomach tightened beneath the waistband of my black dress. I expected my husband to tell Ryan to leave me alone. Instead, Eric asked whether there was some misunderstanding that could be cleared up privately. Ryan's expression changed at once. He had found the unlocked door. He told Eric his father's disinheritance had punished children and grandchildren who had done nothing wrong. He spoke about family legacy, dignity, and money that should have benefited an entire branch rather than one favored granddaughter. I corrected him. The estate documents had been my grandmother's decision, not mine. Ryan nodded as if humoring someone who had memorized the official version. Linda walked over before I could end the conversation. She had caught enough to understand there was an inheritance dispute, and money fascinated her whenever it belonged to someone else. Ryan introduced himself, emphasizing that he was family. Within minutes, Linda was telling him how painful estrangements could become when pride took over. Eric stood beside her, listening with the grave concentration he once used in sales meetings. I felt outnumbered at my own grandmother's funeral, yet nothing openly cruel had happened. That made my discomfort easy to dismiss, even to myself. On the drive back to Brookland, I asked Eric why he had encouraged Ryan. He kept his eyes on the road and said he had only been polite. When I reminded him about the forged checks, he said children should not pay forever for a parent's mistake. Ryan is 48, I replied. He's not a child, and this wasn't his money. Eric drummed his fingers against the steering wheel. After a long silence, he said, 9 years of marriage should mean I trusted his judgment about people. The phrase confused me. Ryan had been back in our lives for less than an hour, yet Eric was already asking me to choose between caution and loyalty. At home, I changed clothes and fed the fish. The tetras rose in quick silver flashes, while the filter hummed against the sudden quiet. Eric remained on the balcony with his phone, speaking too softly for me to hear through the glass. I assumed he was calling Linda, because he often debriefed with her after family events. When he came inside, he looked energized rather than sad. He said he was going to order dinner so I would not have to cook, then kissed the top of my head as if that settled everything. His phone lit up on the counter while he searched for a takeout menu. I was not trying to read it. The preview showed Ryan's name above a message. Good talking with you. I think she'll listen if it comes from you. My skin prickled. Eric snatched up the phone so quickly that the takeout menu slid off the counter. He said Ryan had asked for his number after the funeral, and that they had discussed nothing except lowering the temperature between us. When I asked why Ryan thought Eric could make me listen, my husband gave a weary laugh. Because you're grieving, Maya. He knows you might hear an attack where there isn't one. Somehow, within hours, my caution had become instability. I told Eric there was no misunderstanding to mediate. My grandmother had made her decision after Ryan's father forged her checks, and Ryan was not entitled to reopen her life because the funeral had created an audience. Eric set his phone face down and said I was being rigid. Then he reached for me, promising that he would tell Ryan not to contact us again until the estate attorney dealt with him. That promise was the first false comfort. I wanted my husband back badly enough to accept it without asking to see the message he sent. We ate noodles from paper cartons while the aquarium filter bubbled. and I mistook the absence of another argument for peace. Over the next several days, Eric became attentive in a way that almost embarrassed me for doubting him. He brought coffee to my desk before I left, cleaned the aquarium filter, and asked careful questions about my schedule. He said he had a promising recruiter call coming up and wanted us to reset after the funeral. I told him I would try to leave the clinic earlier on Friday, October 10th, but I also explained that late appointments were part of keeping the business healthy. He kissed my forehead and said he understood. That one word carried me through the week like a handrail. Friday did not cooperate. A client arrived late for a treatment she had booked around her own workday, and one of my staff members needed help resolving a scheduling mistake. By the time I locked the clinic, downtown Washington had gone dark and reflective under streetlights. The drive home took close to the long end of its usual 20 to 35-minute range. I texted Eric before leaving and offered to pick up dinner. He answered, "Don't bother." I read it as kindness rather than punishment, which tells you how determined I still was to preserve the version of our marriage I recognized. When I entered the condo, Eric was on the couch with the television muted. No food was on the counter, and the kitchen had the untouched stillness of a staged listing. He asked whether I knew what time it was. I apologized for the delay and reminded him that I had texted. He said a text did not make dinner appear, then glanced toward the aquarium. The fish gathered at the front because their feeding was late too. I set down my bag, fed them, and heard Eric say, "Of course they get your attention first." The bitterness in his voice was so disproportionate that I turned around holding the open container of flakes. I asked whether his recruiter call had gone badly. He said it had been postponed, then accused me of treating him like a failed applicant instead of a husband. I told him I had only asked because I cared. He paced between the couch and kitchen, saying I used work as an excuse to avoid him, and expected gratitude because I paid the bills. I had never asked for gratitude. I had asked him to keep looking for work, and to share the ordinary labor of our home while he earned zero. Even then, I softened the point, saying we were both under strain and could talk after eating. Would you have cooked dinner at that point just to end the fight? Or would you have refused? Tell me in the comments. Because I did the thing I am least proud of. I opened the refrigerator and started making him a meal. I was exhausted, still wearing clinic shoes, and furious enough that my hands shook while I sliced bread. Yet I thought compliance might prove there was no power contest. Eric watched from the doorway without offering to help. When I placed a plate in front of him, he said, "See? That wasn't hard." Something inside me went very quiet. On Saturday, Eric behaved as though nothing unusual had happened. He suggested we attend Linda's birthday dinner the next evening and said she had been looking forward to seeing us. I did not want to go, but he framed attendance as evidence that I was willing to repair things. He also claimed Ryan had backed off and would leave the estate to the lawyers. That was the hope I accepted. Eric had chosen our marriage. Friday had been an ugly lapse, and Sunday could be normal. I bought Linda a card and spent part of the afternoon catching up on clinic paperwork, so no unfinished task could be used against me later. Linda's Silver Spring home was only 7 miles away, about 25 minutes from Brookland, but the drive on Sunday, October 12th, felt longer. Eric criticized my blouse, then said he was joking when I asked what was wrong with it. Linda greeted him warmly and gave me a quick cheek kiss before asking whether I had managed to make room for family in my schedule. I swallowed the answer I wanted to give. Several relatives were already in the dining room, and the table was crowded with serving dishes and folded cloth napkins. Then I heard a man laughing near the aquarium in Linda's den. Ryan stepped into view holding a drink. I stopped so abruptly that Eric nearly walked into me. He claimed surprise, but he would not meet my eyes. Linda said she had invited Ryan because no one should be excluded during a season of grief. Her phrasing was too polished to be spontaneous. Ryan raised his glass and told me he hoped we could speak like adults. I asked Eric privately whether he had known. He rubbed the back of his neck and admitted Linda had mentioned the invitation, but he had feared I would refuse to come. His confession was quiet, almost tender, as if deceiving me had been an act of conflict prevention. Dinner began with forced conversation about schools, traffic, and people I barely knew. Ryan waited until the plates were full before asking whether my grandmother had ever explained why one side of the family deserved everything. I told him the table was not a probate hearing. He smiled and said that was convenient for me. Eric stared at his food. Linda warned us not to spoil her birthday, although she had seated Ryan directly across from me. Every face at the table carried that uncomfortable alertness people wear when they want drama, but also want immunity from causing it. Ryan said his father had been condemned for one desperate period in 2008, and that my grandmother had allowed resentment to harden into punishment. I reminded him that forged checks were not a family misunderstanding. His jaw tightened. "You inherited her version and her money," he said. "Of course you defend both." I told him he had resurfaced after her funeral to pressure a grieving relative, and that if he had a legal claim, he should make it through counsel. Eric finally spoke, but not for me. He said perhaps everyone needed to acknowledge that I could be dismissive when I felt financially secure. The humiliation came slowly enough that I had time to understand it. Ryan described me as a woman who hid behind work, while Eric sat alone at home. He said my clinic mattered more to me than my marriage, and publicly called me a neglectful wife. Linda did not correct him. Instead, she told the table that Eric had been very lonely lately. I looked at my husband and waited for outrage, denial, anything. He only said, "I've tried to tell her." The people around us lowered their eyes, which was worse than staring. Their silence gave the accusation the weight of a verdict. I asked Ryan what my hours had to do with my grandmother's estate. He leaned back, pleased that I had finally challenged him directly, and said, "Character mattered when one person controlled what should have remained in the family." Then he walked into the den, where Linda's fish tank glowed beneath a cabinet, and tapped the glass with one fingernail. The fish scattered. "You feed everyone just enough to keep them dependent," he said. "Then you call it love." I told him to stop touching the glass. Ryan laughed and said, "Know your place, Maya. You're not the only person entitled to a voice." That was the full confrontation I had been avoiding since the funeral. I stood and told Ryan his father had stolen from my grandmother. He was trying to profit from that betrayal, and he had recruited my unemployed husband and mother-in-law because neither could tolerate a woman whose name appeared on her own assets. Linda gasped. Eric shoved back his chair and accused me of humiliating him. I replied that Ryan had just discussed our marriage before a room full of people. Ryan's face lost its smile. He said I would regret speaking to him that way once the estate records were examined at the probate hearing on Monday, October 20th. I turned to Eric and asked how Ryan knew private details about Friday night. Eric's mouth opened, but Linda answered for him. She said spouses needed guidance when one partner had become controlling. The room seemed to tilt. Eric had not merely complained to his mother after our argument. He had provided material for Ryan to use publicly. I asked whether he had also discussed my income, the condo, or the estate. He told me not to interrogate him in front of family. Ryan's expression gave me the answer before Eric did. My husband had been talking to him all week. We left before dessert. In the car, Eric insisted Ryan had manipulated harmless conversations. He said he had only wanted advice from another man who understood what it felt like to be dismissed. I asked what exactly he thought Ryan understood about our 9-year marriage. Eric gripped the steering wheel and said, 9 years should have earned him an equal voice in everything I owned. There it was again. Time presented as a deed. Marriage as an automatic transfer. I told him sharing a home did not give him authority over my grandmother's estate or permission to hand Ryan information. Eric went silent for the rest of the drive. At the condo, I noticed his laptop open on the dining table. An email from Ryan was visible in the preview pane, thanking Eric for helping with the legal expense. Eric crossed the room and shut the screen, but this time, I did not accept an explanation from behind a closed device. I asked what legal expense meant. He said Ryan needed a consultation to understand whether his claim had merit, and that supporting a conversation was not the same as choosing sides. My pulse began pounding in my throat. I asked whether he had given Ryan money. Eric said it was not a gift. It was a temporary advance. I logged into our joint account from my phone. The transfer was there, $2,400 sent to Ryan. Eric had moved it without asking me. He earned $0, while my clinic income funded the account and every household obligation, including the $620 monthly condo fee. I stared at the transaction until the numbers blurred. Eric said the money belonged to both of us because we were married. He added that Ryan planned to return whatever remained after getting advice. I asked why a supposedly harmless consultation required secrecy. Eric answered that I would have said no, as though predicting my boundary had entitled him to bypass it. I slept in the bedroom with the door locked that night while Eric took the couch. Sleep never really came. Every ordinary sound acquired a threat. A cabinet closing, the floor shifting, the aquarium pump cycling. I kept replaying Friday, when I had made dinner to prove I was not controlling, while Eric had already decided my labor purchased him the right to finance a claim against my own family. The theft was not only the transfer, it was the way he had converted my trust into evidence that I could be managed. Monday, October 13th began with Eric acting eerily composed. He made coffee and said we should meet Linda that evening for a family reset. I refused. He told me his mother believed I was testing how far I could push him, and that my refusal proved her point. I left for the clinic without drinking the coffee. All day my phone filled with messages from him about respect, priorities, and the meaning of partnership. I answered only once, telling him we would discuss the transfer after work, and that no more money was to leave the account. I did not work late that Monday, but Friday had become the charge he intended to prosecute. When I reached my floor, I found blouses, shoes, folded scraps, and 2 garment bags arranged along the condo hallway wall. My suitcase stood beside them. Eric was inside the open doorway with his arms folded. A neighbor's door clicked shut farther down the hall. Heat rushed into my face as I realized he had staged my belongings in a shared space where anyone could see them. He said I needed consequences for working late, failing to make dinner, and disrespecting him in front of his family. Then he repeated Linda's words with the solemn confidence of a man delivering policy. Mom says you're testing my limits so you can walk all over me. He said 9 years of marriage gave him the right to demand standards in his home. For 1 second, I simply stared at him. Honey, this condo is mine. The sentence came out softer than I expected, almost affectionate, which made Eric's expression flicker. I took out my phone and photographed the hallway from both directions, including the open door, the suitcase, and every item he had placed outside. Eric told me to stop being dramatic. I said my clothes were in a common hallway because my unemployed husband had decided I deserved punishment for working late and not cooking dinner. His face hardened at the word unemployed. He invoked our 9 years again, insisting that time made the condo as much his as mine. 9 years had made him my husband. They had never put his name on the deed. That should have been the triumphant moment, but ownership did not magically make me fearless. Eric stood between me and the bedroom, broad-shouldered and furious, while my underwear, clinic scrubs, and shoes sat where neighbors could pass them. I could have pushed inside. I could have shouted until someone called the police. Instead, my legs began trembling so badly that I crouched beside the suitcase and pretended to inspect its zipper. The humiliation from Linda's dinner returned all at once. Ryan tapping the fish tank, strangers avoiding my eyes, Eric admitting he had discussed our private life. My own front door was open, yet I felt homeless. Eric mistook my silence for surrender. He said I could come back in after I apologized and agreed to reasonable expectations, including being home for dinner, unless he approved otherwise. That snapped something into focus. I asked whether he understood that he was demanding permission over the work that produced $7,200 net each month, while he produced $0. He accused me of using money as a weapon. I replied that moving $2,400 to Ryan without my consent had already turned money into a weapon. When he reached for my phone, I stepped back and warned him not to touch me. His hand stopped in the air, but the look he gave me was colder than contact. I carried my belongings inside, one load at a time. Eric did not help. He stood against the wall, telling me that bringing them back did not resolve anything, while I collected shoes by their straps and pressed garment bags against my chest. Each trip past him felt like walking through a checkpoint. After the last blouse was inside, I took my grandmother's estate folder, my passport, clinic records, medication, laptop, and chargers. I left the suitcase packed. Eric watched me and asked where I thought I was going. I told him somewhere that did not require earning admission to my own bedroom. He laughed and said, I always ran to work when marriage became uncomfortable. The clinic was dark when I arrived. I disabled the alarm, locked the glass door behind me, and sat in reception beneath the blue light of the product shelves. The air smelled faintly of eucalyptus, disinfectant, and the wax warmer my staff had switched off before leaving. I had spent years making that space calm for other women. That night, every polished surface reflected a version of me I did not recognize. Swollen eyes, wrinkled blouse, hands gripping my phone as if it were the only solid object left. I lay on a treatment bed beneath 2 clean blankets and listened to the building settle around me. Eric called repeatedly, then shifted to text messages. First, he said I was overreacting. Then, he said Linda believed living overnight counted as abandonment. Finally, he wrote that Ryan had warned him I might try to manipulate the property records. That message chilled me more than the empty clinic. Ryan had taken Eric's resentment and given it legal-sounding vocabulary, while Eric had handed him access to our marriage. I did not answer. I saved screenshots, emailed copies to a private address Eric could not access, and changed the passwords on my business banking, email, and clinic management system. At nearly dawn, I redirected future clinic deposits away from the joint account. Tuesday, October 14th, arrived gray and sharp-edged after almost no sleep. I washed my face in the staff restroom. applied concealer with the same careful motions I used when teaching clients, and called Naomi Price as soon as business hours began. Naomi was 42, a real estate attorney who had reviewed documents for me before. I had expected her to offer an appointment later in the week. Instead, after hearing that Eric had placed my possessions in the hallway and claimed ownership, she told me to bring every property record I had. Her voice was calm, without being soothing. At that point, calm was more useful than sympathy. Naomi spread the documents across a conference table and checked them against the title records. My name appeared alone on the deed. The condo had been mine before the marriage. The mortgage and the $620 monthly condo fee had been paid from my earnings, and there was no recorded transfer giving Eric an ownership interest. Naomi cautioned me that separating from a spouse was not the same as removing a stranger. I could not simply change the locks while he was still lawfully living there. But his claim that 9 years automatically put him on the title was false, and he had no right to exile the titled owner by dumping her clothes outside. Hearing that should have steadied me. Instead, I started crying in Naomi's conference room. I hated myself for it because nothing new had happened. The deed had always said what I knew it said. Yet I had needed another woman to tell me that my own memory was reliable. Naomi pushed a box of tissues toward me and waited without feeling the silence. When I finally apologized, she said, "Maya, people apologize when they spill coffee. You are discovering that your husband has been rehearsing a reality in which your work belongs to him, your property belongs to him, and your objections are abuse. Cry if you need to. Then document." We reviewed the joint account. Naomi could not act as my divorce attorney, but she explained what records a family law colleague at her firm would need and helped me preserve the transfer details. $2,400 had gone to Ryan. Eric had called it a temporary advance, but no loan agreement existed, no repayment date appeared, and the purpose was a consultation supporting a claim against my grandmother's estate. Naomi advised me not to drain the account or conceal money. I left enough to cover legitimate shared obligations, secured my future earnings, froze my credit, and downloaded statements showing exactly where every dollar had come from. Then Naomi asked the question I had been avoiding. Did I want to preserve the marriage, or did I want Eric out under a written separation agreement? If you think putting my clothes in the hallway ended the marriage, write yes or no. By the end, you'll know what I chose and what it cost me. Sitting there, I still could not say the word separation without feeling as though I had failed some final exam. I remembered Eric steaming his funeral shirt, bringing me water, cleaning the aquarium filter. Cruelty had not erased every tender memory. It had merely made each one evidence against my own judgment. My phone rang while I was still at Naomi's table. Eric left a voicemail saying he had gone to Linda's house because I had made the condo emotionally unsafe. He demanded written assurance that I would not change the locks or dispose of his belongings. The nerve of that request was almost elegant. Naomi listened with my permission and said his concern about access showed someone had coached him. I told her Ryan had been communicating with him since the funeral. Naomi asked whether Ryan had ever received confidential estate documents from me. I said no, but Eric had been near my files and knew where I kept them. We returned to the condo together, not because Naomi was acting as security, but because she needed copies of the purchase and payment records stored there, and I no longer trusted myself to enter alone. Eric was gone. The hallway had been cleared, but the bedroom drawers remained open from his search for my clothes. My grandmother's folder was safe in my bag. The aquarium light glowed across the living room, and the fish rushed forward when I approached. I fed them automatically, then noticed a pale rectangle in the dust beneath the laptop stand. It was the outline of an external drive Eric normally kept there. The drive itself was missing. I checked the laptop he had left behind without opening his private files. The machine was locked, but a handwritten note beside it listed Ryan's email address and the probate hearing date, Monday, October 20th. Beneath that, Eric had written, "Statement re Maya's control." My stomach cramped so violently that I had to sit down. Naomi photographed the note and told me not to speculate in writing about what the missing drive contained. We would preserve facts: the timing, the transfer, the communications I had seen, and Eric's access to the condo. She then called her colleague and arranged for a proposed separation agreement to be prepared. That afternoon, I sent Ryan a written demand for the return of the money. I did not accuse him of theft, because Eric had authorized the transfer from a joint account. I stated that the funds came from my earnings, that I had not consented to financing his inheritance claim, and that all further contact should go through counsel. Ryan answered with a paragraph about family justice, but by evening the account showed a return of $2,100. He had spent $300 on the consultation. The arithmetic was simple. 2,400 minus 300 equaled 2,100. The betrayal remained harder to calculate. Eric called after noticing the changed deposit arrangements. He said I was financially abusing him by protecting income he had helped me become successful enough to earn. I reminded him that he had mocked my clinic as fancy, resented my hours, and used my money to support Ryan. He lowered his voice and said I was destroying 9 years over one bad weekend. I almost believed that framing until I looked at the hallway photographs. Friday's dinner demand, Sunday's public humiliation, Monday's staged eviction, and the missing drive were not one mistake. They were a system, and the system worked only while I kept translating contempt into stress. By Wednesday, Eric had retained advice of his own through Linda's contacts and refused to leave unless I admitted he had an equitable claim to the condo. Naomi's colleague sent back a proposed agreement that allowed Eric time to collect his belongings, preserved both sides' legal positions, and barred either of us from moving joint funds without written consent. I did not sign immediately. I sat at my dining table while rain clouds gathered beyond the windows and ran my finger over a faint scratch Eric had made assembling the table years earlier. The condo held proof that he had lived there. It did not prove he owned it, and it did not obligate me to remain his wife. That evening, Linda arrived without warning and stood outside my door holding a covered casserole. I did not let her in. Linda shifted the casserole from one hand to the other and said she only wanted 5 minutes. Through the peephole, I saw rain beginning to spot the shoulders of her beige coat. I kept the chain latched and opened the door just far enough to tell her that any discussion about Eric leaving would happen through counsel. Her mouth pinched. She said marriage was not a courtroom and accused Naomi of poisoning me against my family. You helped your son put my clothes in a public hallway, I said. Do not bring food here and pretend you came to nourish me. Linda's eyes flicked toward the neighboring door, suddenly worried someone might hear. She lowered her voice and claimed she had never told Eric to remove my belongings. She had only said I was testing his limits, and he had interpreted that advice too aggressively. That distinction apparently comforted her. I asked whether she had also encouraged him to discuss my income and grandmother's estate with Ryan. Linda admitted Ryan had seemed knowledgeable about marital fairness, then insisted Eric deserved security after 9 years. I told her security was not the same as title, and dependence was not ownership. Before closing the door, I asked her to take the casserole to the son she had taught to punish a working woman for not serving dinner. She stood there long enough for the hallway light to switch off automatically. On Thursday, Eric asked to meet at Naomi's office with the family law colleague who had drafted the separation agreement. He arrived wearing the same navy jacket he used for interviews and carried the missing external drive in a padded envelope. He said he had taken it accidentally while packing chargers at Linda's house. Nobody believed that, including him. With both attorneys present, he admitted the drive held photographs of documents from my grandmother's folder and notes he had made for Ryan. He insisted he had never copied account numbers or original signatures. Naomi placed the envelope on the conference table without touching it, and said a forensic review could determine exactly what had been stored, deleted, or transferred. Eric's confidence drained when my attorney explained that the signed agreement did not require him to confess to a crime or surrender any claim he genuinely believed he had. It required him to live peacefully, preserve evidence, return my property, stop moving joint funds, and communicate through counsel. If he refused, I was prepared to seek court intervention and document the hallway incident, the financial transfer, and his attempt to assist an adverse inheritance claim. The neighbor who had seen my belongings outside had already agreed to describe what she witnessed. Eric stared at me as if my preparation were a new betrayal. "You planned all this fast," he said. I answered, "You made danger efficient." He signed late that afternoon, but the agreement allowed him until Friday, October 17th, to collect the rest of his things. Cold rain swept across Brooklyn that morning, flattening leaves against the sidewalk and rattling the balcony door. Eric arrived with Linda and moving supplies, while I remained in the condo, with my attorney nearby, and photographed the rooms before and after. Linda wrapped dishes that had belonged to Eric before our marriage. He took his clothes, computer equipment, books, and the aquarium tools he had purchased. He paused beside the tank and asked whether I even knew how to clean the filter. I said I could learn, the same way I had learned payroll, licensing, taxes, and every other task someone once implied was beyond me. The last item he carried out was the handheld facial steamer he had nearly ruined on the morning of my grandmother's funeral. He held it up and said it was technically his, because I had given it to him to use. I almost laughed at the pettiness, then told him to take it. That small machine was not worth another argument about possession. At the doorway, Eric looked around the condo he had called home for 9 years and said I would eventually understand how much he had contributed. "Living here mattered," I told him. "It just didn't make you the owner." The title and 9 years of payment records confirmed what sentiment could not rewrite. The condo was mine. Linda waited under the building awning while rain streaked the parked car. She would not look at me. Eric loaded the final box, then returned the keys as the agreement required. His hand remained open afterward, as if he expected me to place something else in it. Money, forgiveness, proof that he still had leverage. I gave him nothing. When the elevator doors closed, grief hit so hard that I braced myself against the wall. I had wanted the man from the funeral morning to reappear and say he had been frightened, manipulated, ashamed. Instead, the man leaving was still angry that evidence had failed to obey him. The forensic review of the drive was limited and handled through counsel. It showed photographs of selected estate papers, draft notes attacking my judgment, and messages Eric had saved from Ryan. There was no secret will, altered deed, or document capable of changing the estate. What it did show was coordination. Ryan had coached Eric to portray me as controlling and emotionally unstable, while Eric had offered private details about my schedule, income, and marriage in return for validation. The material was shared with the estate's attorney before the hearing. Eric's lawyer then confirmed that Eric would not support Ryan's allegations under oath. Apparently, resentment felt different when perjury warnings entered the room. On Monday, October 20th, I drove the 3 miles from Brooklyn to DC Superior Court in about 15 minutes. It was the 7th day since Eric had displayed my clothes in the hallway, and the first morning I entered a public building without wondering whether my own memory would be put on trial. Naomi came as my support and to address any property-related misrepresentation, while the attorney handling my grandmother's estate carried the organized files she had left behind. The courthouse smelled of wet coats, old paper, and burnt coffee. Ryan arrived alone, with a slim folder and the expression of a man expecting moral outrage to compensate for missing evidence. Before the hearing, he caught me near a quiet section of the corridor, while Naomi was speaking with estate counsel. No one else stood close enough to hear. Ryan did not threaten me. He looked tired, almost sincere, and said, "My father died believing your grandmother erased us, and if I let this go, then she gets to decide we never belonged." That was the motive beneath all his talk of fairness. He believed inheritance could reverse exile and transform his father's forgery into a wound inflicted on him. I understood it then, but understanding did not make him entitled to recruit my husband, invade my marriage, or claim a dead woman's property against her documented wishes. Inside the courtroom, Ryan's fury collapsed under ordinary questions. He alleged my grandmother had been improperly influenced and had unfairly punished his entire branch for his father's conduct in 2008. The estate attorney produced her executed documents, correspondence with independent counsel, financial records establishing the forged checks, and notes showing that she had reviewed her decisions while competent and without me directing them. The lawyer who prepared the relevant estate documents confirmed her instructions had been clear and consistent. My clinic records and communications showed I had not arranged or controlled those meetings. Ryan had suspicion, family resentment, and photographs obtained through my estranged husband. He had no evidence of coercion, fraud, or a later promise overriding the estate plan. Then the returned money became relevant. The transfer record showed Eric had sent Ryan $2,400 from our joint account after they began coordinating. Ryan had spent $300 on a consultation and returned $2,100 only after my written demand. His own response described that money as support for exploring family justice. The judge asked whether Ryan had understood that the funds came from the earnings of the same person he was accusing of manipulating the estate. Ryan tried to say marital money belonged equally to both spouses. Naomi clarified that no ownership interest in my condo had ever been transferred to Eric, and estate counsel emphasized that marital resentment was not probate evidence. Ryan's face darkened when the court rejected his attempt to turn Eric's complaints into proof about my grandmother. He said I had controlled Eric with money and thrown him out once he challenged me. My hallway photographs, the neighbor's written account, the sole title, and the separation agreement answered him. I had not placed Eric's belongings outside. He had put mine in the common hallway and demanded that I earn re-entry by apologizing for working late and failing to make dinner. Eric had then left under a negotiated agreement with legal advice. The judge's expression did not change, but Ryan finally stopped looking pleased with himself. The court found no adequate basis for his challenge to proceed, and his inheritance claim collapsed. The estate documents remained controlling. Ryan was not awarded the legacy he believed his branch had been denied, and the photographs Eric supplied did nothing except expose how they had obtained them. There was no dramatic gavel strike, only a measured ruling, and the sound of paper being gathered. Yet that restraint made the result feel more final. Ryan had built his case from humiliation, grievance, and the assumption that a woman's boundaries proved dishonesty. Under oath and procedure, those materials had no structural strength at all. Outside the courtroom, Ryan followed me down the stone steps and said I had won because I knew how to make paperwork look righteous. Morning traffic moved beyond the plaza, indifferent to both of us. He accused me of protecting my place at the expense of family. I stopped, turned, and gave him back the phrase he had used while tapping Linda's fish tank. Know your place, Ryan. It is not in my marriage, my bank account, my condo, or my grandmother's will. Naomi, a state counsel, and several people leaving the courtroom heard every word. Ryan opened his mouth, but, for once, he had no audience willing to mistake volume for a claim. Consequences arrived without the clean symmetry people expect from stories. Ryan lost his challenge and the $300 he had spent on the consultation, but he never apologized. Relatives who had watched him humiliate me at Linda's birthday dinner stopped inviting him, not because they suddenly became brave, but because the court record made association embarrassing. Linda sent one message, saying the family had been torn apart by legal escalation. I answered that her son had escalated our disagreement by putting my possessions outside and funding Ryan with my earnings. She did not respond. Her silence lasted longer than any lecture she had ever given me. Eric moved in with Linda while the divorce proceeded through attorneys over the following months. He did not gain ownership of the condo merely because we had been married for 9 years, and he could not erase the records showing I had paid the mortgage and the $620 monthly fee. The final financial resolution required proper negotiation rather than a magical courtroom victory, and I paid legal fees, lost sleep, and mourned a marriage I had once believed was generous. Eric eventually stopped calling himself between careers and began applying seriously for work again, according to what his attorney relayed during settlement discussions. Losing access to my income forced him to confront what dependence had allowed him to avoid. I kept the condo. I also kept the clinic, my professional license, my credit, and the part of myself that had almost disappeared while I tried to prove love by absorbing disrespect. $7,200 net each month no longer flowed into an account where someone could quietly finance a campaign against me.